There is a terrifying pattern in the history of human power. The greatest empires rarely die by murder. They die by suicide. A democracy famed for its intellect, its wealth, and its unmatched maritime supremacy committed one of antiquity's most devastating strategic blunders, not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to mistake its own desires for geopolitical necessity. In 415 BC, the city-state of Athens, already locked in a civilization-defining struggle with Sparta, chose to hurl a vast, unprecedented armada toward the distant island of Sicily. The question before the Athenian Assembly was never whether the city possessed the strength to launch such an endeavor. The true question, the one that still haunts the halls of modern superpowers, was whether that immense strength had completely unmoored their strategic judgment. The Sicilian Expedition stands as one of history's purest, most agonizing strategic tragedies, precisely because its internal logic was so seductive, so expansive, and so catastrophically incomplete. Athens did not sail west merely for adventure, nor for simple plunder. It sailed because the architecture of empire had taught its citizens a highly dangerous lesson, that insecurity could be permanently solved by relentless expansion. They believed that distant intervention could quiet local anxieties, and that a massive, bold offensive might decisively resolve a war whose grinding ambiguities had become politically intolerable at home. That specific, intoxicating belief has echoed across the centuries. Powerful states repeatedly decide that restraint feels passive, that caution is a form of cowardice, and that expansion is the only true proof of control. But history's severest punishments are almost always reserved for powers that cannot distinguish between the two. To understand the magnitude of this self-inflicted wound, we must look at the grand chessboard of the Mediterranean. By the time the expedition was conceived, the Greek world had already been deeply traumatized and transformed by the Peloponnesian War. Athens remained a formidable naval empire, rich in the tribute of its subject states, disciplined at sea, and entirely accustomed to converting its maritime supremacy into absolute political leverage. Sparta, its great rival, remained less dazzling but deeply, existentially dangerous. Resilient on land, deeply conservative in its methods, and masterfully formidable in managing its coalition of allies. This was not a simple contest between democratic genius and oligarchic backwardness. It was a clash of two entirely different strategic civilizations. Athens had mastered mobility, commerce, and the relentless extraction of imperial wealth. Sparta had mastered endurance, strict alliance discipline, and the terrifying weaponization of time. The Peace of Nicias, concluded in 421 BC, did not settle this monumental rivalry. It merely froze it into a highly unstable, deeply paranoid configuration. The treaties were signed, but the suspicion remained absolute. Proxy conflicts flared in the shadows. Allies constantly doubted the commitments of their protectors. Geopolitical prestige remained fiercely contested on a daily basis. In such a toxic atmosphere, peace did not actually feel like peace. It felt like a suspended sentence. That psychological condition matters deeply because strategic overreach rarely emerges in moments of total, blinding chaos. It almost always emerges in periods of unresolved, grinding tension, when political elites grow utterly impatient with ambiguity and begin frantically searching for a magical, decisive transformation of the global board. Athens was uniquely vulnerable to this imperial temptation because it was no longer simply a city defending its own walls and local farms. It was a sprawling, complex imperial system. Tribute flowed endlessly from subject allies across the Aegean. Forward garrisons, patrolling fleets, and absolute legal authority reinforced Athenian predominance over dozens of other city-states. This daily habit of imperial management fundamentally altered the psychology of the Athenian electorate. Over time, expansion entirely ceased to seem exceptional. It became the baseline definition of normal. Force projected outward had, for decades, repeatedly generated revenue, prestige, and a buffer of security. Therefore, a vast majority of Athenians no longer viewed expansion as a dangerous gamble against stability. They viewed it as the very engine of stability itself. That is the first, most fatal distortion of empire. Success in one theater inevitably teaches the ruling power to dangerously universalize its methods. Sicily, and above all the immensely powerful city of Syracuse, drew the gaze of Athens because it appeared to offer the ultimate strategic multiplication. Sicily was famously fertile. It possessed vast wealth, deep pools of manpower, and critical maritime positioning. Syracuse itself was no minor, easily intimidated town. It was a major Greek power dominating the Western Mediterranean, fully capable of tipping the broader balance of the entire Hellenic world. In the overheated Athenian imagination, a decisive victory in Sicily might accomplish several grand strategic objectives simultaneously. It would endlessly enrich the state treasury, secure vital and permanent grain supplies, intimidate or absorb every other independent Sicilian city, permanently choke off Spartan options in the west, and spectacularly elevate Athens from a mere Aegean hegemon into a truly invincible trans-Mediterranean superpower. This was not merely a plan for conquest. It was a mesmerizing vision of compounded, irreversible advantage. The formal, diplomatic pretext for the invasion arrived conveniently through the small Sicilian city of Segesta, which sent envoys to Athens begging for military aid against its local rivals and the encroaching Syracusan sphere of influence. But great states rarely, if ever, mobilize immense resources and risk their entire survival because of formal diplomatic pretexts alone. Beneath the tearful appeals of the Segestan diplomats lay a far deeper, far darker strategic temptation for Athens. The alluring idea that launching a massive intervention hundreds of miles away might somehow cure the gnawing anxiety at home. The Cold War with Sparta remained fundamentally unresolved. The Athenian populace hungered desperately for the initiative. Sicily offered something psychologically irresistible to a restless democracy. Not just a new battlefield, but a sweeping narrative of reversal, of boundless expansion, and of restored momentum. It whispered the ultimate imperial lie, that the future might be violently seized, rather than patiently endured. This brings us to the opening lesson of the entire Sicilian tragedy. Powerful states routinely misread highly optional expansion as absolute strategic necessity, simply because their domestic political systems reward the appearance of boldness far more than the quiet virtue of prudence. Once a political culture begins to treat restraint as the vocabulary of fear, grand, reckless projects suddenly acquire a terrifying aura of inevitability. The expedition to Sicily was conceived, birthed, and launched entirely inside that aura. The momentous debate in the Athenian Assembly brought forward three starkly different strategic temperaments, perfectly embodied in three commanders: Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lamachus. Their clash was not merely a dramatic collision of outsized personalities. It was a profound, philosophical struggle over what imperial power actually meant, how existential risk should be calculated, and what sort of war Athens actually believed it was fighting. Alcibiades was the expedition's supreme, dazzling salesman. Brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious, fiercely charismatic, and dangerously persuasive, he argued passionately that Sicily was merely the gateway to a much broader, permanent reordering of global power. Conquer Syracuse, he promised, and the rest of Sicily will inevitably bend the knee. Gain the immense wealth of Sicily and Athenian resources, shipbuilding capacity, and Allied manpower would expand exponentially. Expand that western base, and Athens could return to crush its enemies across a vastly wider strategic arc, rendering Sparta entirely obsolete. This was the pure doctrine of expansion as geopolitical multiplication, an entirely offensive theory of state security in which every single victory automatically generated the capacity for the next. Alcibiades understood a timeless, deeply cynical political truth. The most intoxicating arguments for war are never those that promise mere survival. They are those that promise transformed, limitless greatness. Nicias stood in almost absolute opposition to this fevered dream. Often dismissed by later historians as merely overly cautious or painfully timid, Nicias was in fact something much more interesting and vastly more tragic. Nicias possessed the rare, vital institutional memory of limits. He understood scale. He desperately tried to make the assembly recognize that Sicily was not some nearby island that could be easily chastened by a quick naval demonstration. It was a vast, politically complex, fiercely independent landmass, anchored by Syracuse, a power highly organized and substantial enough to resist a siege. He pointed out that the intelligence available to Athens was woefully incomplete, heavily biased by the Suggestions. Most importantly, he reminded them that the existential war with Sparta right in their own backyard remained dangerously unsettled. Therefore, the central, piercing question for Nicias was not whether a victory in Sicily was technically possible, but whether Athens could define what victory actually looked like clearly enough to justify the staggering cost. This is the exact question that imperial systems always hate the most, because it coldly demands boundaries. Yet, in his desperate attempt to save his city, Nicias committed one of the most spectacularly consequential rhetorical miscalculations in the entirety of ancient history. Attempting to shock and deter the war-hungry assembly, he strategically changed his argument. Instead of arguing against the war on principle, he argued that a successful expedition would require an absolutely colossal, almost unimaginable commitment of resources. Hundreds of expensive triremes, thousands of elite hoplites, an absolute fortune in silver, and an unbreakable multi-year logistical commitment. He fully intended this terrifying arithmetic as a warning. But the warning instantly reversed itself in the minds of the crowd. The Democratic Assembly interpreted this massive scale not as a sobering reason for caution, but as thrilling proof that Athens was grand enough, rich enough, and powerful enough to easily accomplish the task. If the general said they needed a massive armada, they would simply vote him a massive armada. Therefore, the expedition was wildly approved on an even grander, more expensive scale than Alcibiades had originally dared to ask for. This is the chilling phenomenon of democratic escalation through rhetorical inversion. A prudent man accurately describes the terrifying magnitude of the undertaking. An excited, hubristic polity hears only the supreme grandeur of the undertaking. Lamachus, the third commander, is far less celebrated in popular memory, yet he possessed perhaps the absolute clearest immediate military instinct of them all. He favored absolute speed, relentless aggression, and the maximum exploitation of initial shock. He understood that Syracuse, before it fully organized its defenses and called upon its allies, was highly vulnerable to a sudden decapitation strike. Therefore, Lamachus argued, delay was the ultimate danger. If Athens truly intended to strike this blow, it needed to strike instantly and decisively, before local Sicilian resistance could consolidate, and long before outside Spartan support could possibly arrive. Lamachus intuitively grasped what elite military professionals throughout all of history have firmly understood. Once a distant, complex expedition loses its forward tempo, the grinding friction of logistics and the toxic rot of domestic politics will inevitably begin to devour whatever tactical advantages you initially held. But pure strategic clarity is of absolutely no use when the supreme command itself is politically fractured. And that fracture split open almost immediately. On the very eve of the Armada's departure, the city of Athens was suddenly convulsed by the mysterious, widespread mutilation of the Hermes, sacred statues that stood throughout the city. It was a shocking, deeply unsettling act of religious and political desecration. Instant, blinding suspicion spread through the democratic streets. Fears of a sweeping oligarchic conspiracy to overthrow the government intensified into a full-blown civic panic. Alcibiades, already a highly polarizing and deeply envied figure, became immediately entangled in the political witch hunt. Though he was initially allowed to sail with the Grand Fleet, the political operatives in Athens bided their time, and he was shortly recalled to stand trial for his life. Here, the Sicilian Expedition vividly encountered one of history's most profound and revealing truths. A state may successfully assemble vast, world-ending material power, yet entirely sabotage its own existence through internal political mistrust. Athens proudly launched one of the largest, most complex military operations in its entire history, while simultaneously, willfully destabilizing the very command structure required to lead it. Alcibiades, knowing that a politically motivated trial in an enraged democracy meant certain death, did not return obediently. He defected. The geopolitical consequences of this single defection were literally world-shattering. A supremely talented, utterly reckless architect of the Athenian expedition now became an intimate, highly motivated advisor to the Spartan enemy. To the Spartan kings, Alcibiades coolly offered strategic insight of the absolute highest, most devastating order. Occupy the fortress of Dacelia in the region of Attica, he advised them, and you will impose permanent, year-round economic pressure and terror on Athens in its own home territory. Furthermore, immediately send military support to Syracuse, and transform this isolated Sicilian theater from a peripheral Athenian adventure into a bleeding, direct front in the main Peloponnesian War. Few decisions in the history of warfare are as completely devastating as willingly handing a highly adaptive enemy the exact blueprint of your own strategic assumptions. Alcibiades did not simply change sides. He expertly translated Athenian strategic logic into Spartan geopolitical opportunity. Therefore, the great Athenian expedition was critically compromised before its decisive phase had ever truly begun. The fatal problem was never a shortage of sleek ships or brave men. The fatal problem was the absolute absence of unity, the toxic contamination of military command by domestic political panic, and the complete lack of agreement about what a terminal victory actually required. Athens had successfully projected massive physical strength westward, but it had completely failed to project strategic coherence. That subtle distinction would shortly prove to be fatal. When the magnificent armada finally arrived in the waters of Sicily, its sheer, overwhelming magnitude seemed to completely vindicate Athenian imperial confidence. The fleet was absolutely enormous. The spectacle alone carried an immense psychological force that terrified local observers. To the cities of Sicily, this looked exactly like the arrival of an irresistible, world-ending power. But sheer magnitude is never the same thing as a strategic decision. States routinely, disastrously mistake the mere possession of overwhelming means for the actual execution of a coherent strategy. The Athenians possessed the unquestionable ability to heavily intimidate, but due to divided command and cautious maneuvering, they entirely failed to convert that initial intimidation into rapid, immediate, and irreversible political gains. Time, therefore, remained available to the city of Syracuse, and time is almost always the hidden, most powerful ally of the defender. Syracuse initially faced genuine, mortal danger. The city was not perfectly prepared for an onslaught of this scale. Internal political divisions and deep civic uncertainty existed within its walls. But weaker states, when placed under the absolute, crushing pressure of mortal danger, often discover a profound advantage that immensely powerful states tend to entirely forget. Raw necessity drastically accelerates institutional learning. Failure for the Syracusans was not going to be an abstract embarrassment debated in an assembly. It was going to be total subjugation, death, and slavery. Therefore, adaptation within Syracuse became violently urgent. The city rapidly reorganized its democratic structures. It frantically rallied its local allies. New, hardened leaders emerged who deeply understood that mere survival required immense speed of thought just as much as it required physical courage on the walls. This reveals one of the absolute oldest, most unbreakable patterns in the history of war. While comfort and overwhelming superiority can slowly paralyze empires, existential danger can spectacularly sharpen republics. The Athenians, meanwhile, floundered. They struggled endlessly to align their grand strategy with the actual conditions on the ground. Minor raids and tactical maneuvers occurred. Local alliances were tentatively sought. Various defensive positions were debated and weighed. But the absolute central requirement remained exactly what the dead Lamachus had seen from the very beginning. The military pressure had to become totally decisive before Syracuse and its allies stabilized the political situation. Instead, the operational tempo completely slackened. The windows of opportunity rapidly narrowed. The brutal difference between a highly successful expedition and a doomed, trapped expedition is very rarely measured in moments of battlefield valor. It is almost always measured in whether the attacker's initial superiority is ruthlessly converted into the enemy's political collapse before the enemy learns exactly how to resist. Eventually, under the cautious guidance of Nicias, Athens slowly moved toward the crucial, grinding objective, completely encircling the massive city of Syracuse through the construction of vast siege works, the famous circumvallation. This was grand strategy stripped down to its starkest, most agonizing, and most revealing physical form. This was not a war of glorious cavalry charges or heroic individual combat. This was brutal engineering. It was the frantic construction of stone walls, the digging of trenches, the building of counterwalls, and a desperate, exhausting race to completely close off a massive city's final options before external relief could arrive. If the Athenian army successfully completed the unbroken encirclement, Syracuse, cut off from food and allies, might eventually be forced into starving submission. But if Syracuse managed to break the construction process with intersecting counterwalls and the infusion of external support, the entire mathematical logic of the campaign would violently reverse. Therefore, every single trench dug in the dirt, every single segment of stone wall laid in the Sicilian sun, carried massive civilizational weight. In such grueling moments, warfare entirely ceases to be a romantic adventure. It becomes a brutal mathematical contest of time, civilian morale, and absolute institutional discipline. And then, at the precise apex of this tension, came the turning point in human form, the arrival of the Spartan commander Gylippus. The strategic equation was instantly, irrevocably transformed. The significance of Gylippus was not merely his tactical competence, though he was deeply competent. His true significance was that his arrival firmly signaled to everyone on the island that Sicily was no longer a remote, isolated Athenian adventure existing in a neat, separate compartment of the war. It had now become fully integrated into the massive, zero-sum struggle of the larger Peloponnesian War. This massive escalation should have immediately forced a fundamental, ruthless reassessment in Athenian strategic thinking. The entire original logic of the expedition had strictly depended on the arrogant belief that Sicily could be completely mastered before the main war back in Greece decisively intervened. But now, the main war had quite literally arrived on the shores of Sicily. Gylippus brought ruthless organization, martial confidence, and the terrifying prestige of Spartan military involvement. Syracuse, which had already been adapting rapidly, now gained a supreme leader fully capable of sharpening their resistance and coordinating highly aggressive, unified action. Rapid Spartan counterworks brilliantly disrupted the Athenian siege lines. The once promising possibility of a quick, clean strangulation of the city entirely vanished. Athens still possessed highly formidable physical strength, but the entire underlying logic of the campaign was violently shifting. It was morphing from a war of offensive, sweeping expansion into a war of grinding, contested attrition far from home. This was the exact, fleeting moment at which a disciplined, rational theory of limits might have saved the Athenian Empire. It was the moment to negotiate or to leave. They did neither. Instead, the democracy made its second, even more catastrophic grand commitment. Athens actively chose not to cut its losses, but to massively reinforce failure. The highly capable General Demosthenes was dispatched across the sea with a second enormous fleet and thousands of fresh troops. This fateful decision is very often dismissed by casual observers as simple, unhinged irrationality. Yet the deeper, more terrifying reality is far more unsettling. The move possessed a grim, inescapable internal logic. The Athenians reasoned thus: if the position in Sicily was still technically recoverable, then abandoning it now would completely waste all prior sacrifice and humiliatingly surrender the strategic initiative to Sparta. Conversely, if throwing even more overwhelming force into the meat grinder could somehow restore the lost momentum, then a massive reinforcement might still miraculously convert all this hardship into a legendary victory. Therefore, the empire doubled down. This is precisely how the psychology of sunk costs operates at an imperial scale, not as sheer madness entirely detached from reason, but as a form of corrupted reason that is hopelessly trapped inside the gravity of its own prior investments. When Demosthenes finally arrived and surveyed the grim theater, he assessed the terrifying situation with the cold, hard clarity of a seasoned realist. The conditions on the ground were radically worsening. Daily attrition mounted. Troop morale was deeply frayed. Horrific disease was rapidly spreading in the confined, swampy, and unhealthy conditions near the stalled siege lines. The tactical prospects had completely narrowed. Demosthenes deeply understood a strategic truth that many fresh commanders perceive far more clearly than entrenched, exhausted ones. A military campaign may still contain thousands of incredibly brave men, massive material resources, and fleeting, isolated tactical opportunities, yet simultaneously be entirely, irreversibly decaying at the strategic level. Therefore, seeing the trap closing, he forcefully urged an immediate, complete withdrawal. This was not cowardice. It was supreme strategic courage. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the survival of the larger empire by brutally accepting the bitter failure of one specific theater. But Nicias hesitated. And in that agonizing, fatal hesitation, the grand tragedy of Athens reached its deepest, most devastating register. His catastrophic delay has very often been attributed strictly to his religious piety, and piety was indeed a massive factor. But the full psychological picture is vastly broader and tragically human. Nicias was terrified of the judgment awaiting him at home. He deeply feared that an unforced withdrawal would be instantly interpreted by the radical politicians in Athens as treasonous failure, absolutely ruining his reputation and likely costing him his life. Furthermore, He desperately wanted to believe his own flawed intelligence reports suggesting that Syracuse itself was near total financial exhaustion. He had lived inside the brutal, warped logic of this campaign for entirely too long to simply abandon the intoxicating hope that just one more effort, one more week, might miraculously redeem all the horrific prior costs. In the unforgiving realm of war, hesitation is never merely the passive absence of movement. It is the active, fatal victory of conflicting internal fears over decisive, rational thought. And then, as if written by a cruel playwright, the lunar eclipse appeared in the night sky. What should have been a difficult, highly complex naval retreat instantly became a fatal, permanent delay. Nicias, deeply influenced by the religious interpretations of the soothsayers, entirely postponed the departure of the fleet for nearly a month. Modern minds, comfortable in their secular rationality, sometimes casually dismiss this as mere foolish superstition, but that deeply misreads the ancient world. In the high-stakes realms of ancient politics and warfare, religion was not a private, harmless ornament. It fundamentally structured political legitimacy, the morale of the rank and file, and the very meaning of existential risk. A weary commander, already paralyzed by the fear of democratic blame, now encountered a massive celestial sign that made immediate, decisive action seem not only physically dangerous, but cosmically impious. Therefore, absolute operational necessity violently yielded to deep cultural belief at the worst possible moment in Athenian history. The deeper, more terrifying lesson here is not simply that ancient men believed strange things. The lesson is that absolutely every society on Earth possesses rigid frameworks of legitimacy that can utterly paralyze rational decision-making whenever human fear desperately seeks a righteous justification. The Syracusans and their Spartan allies ruthlessly seized the advantage. The religious delay allowed them to completely, physically tighten the trap around the Athenian fleet. The great harbor of Syracuse now became the horrific arena of final, total strategic inversion. Athens had originally entered Sicily entirely to project its absolute freedom of action through unmatched naval mastery. But in the highly confined, tightly blocked waters directly before Syracuse, the supreme maneuverability of the Athenian triremes could no longer function as it had in the open sea. The geometry of the battle narrowed. Tactical disorder wildly multiplied. Heavy Syracusan ships ruthlessly rammed the lighter, trapped Athenian vessels. The very instrument that had built the Athenian Empire, its unmatched navy, was forced into conditions that entirely blunted its unique strengths. Therefore, the harbor ceased to be a pathway of imperial domination. It rapidly became a horrific, inescapable chamber of suffocation. The final, desperate naval battles utterly shattered the expedition's last coherent hope of survival. Frantic attempts to break out through the blockade entirely failed. The Athenian crews were exhausted, terrified, and outmatched in the confined space. Coordination completely faltered. Syracusan resistance, fully hardened by the absolute necessity of survival and guided by vastly improved leadership, proved brutally equal to the hour. Once the Athenian command of movement was permanently lost, the entire, massive, wider structure of the expedition collapsed with startling, terrifying speed. The Athenians could no longer sustain their land siege, they could no longer freely withdraw across the sea, and they could no longer transform their localized force into any sort of strategic choice. This was the true, ultimate disaster. Not merely a simple tactical defeat, but the absolute, permanent loss of all freedom of action. What relentlessly followed on land merely completed the ruin. The surviving, shattered Athenian forces attempted a desperate, agonizing retreat inland under completely horrific conditions. They were endlessly harried by enemy cavalry, deeply exhausted, starving, dying of thirst, and increasingly cut off from any hope of rescue. Demosthenes and Nicias each, in their separate columns, eventually faced the final, inescapable arithmetic of a completely broken expedition. Unconditional surrender and horrific slaughter violently replaced all prior imperial expectation. Proud commanders who had confidently led one of the greatest, most expensive armaments of the entire ancient age now helplessly presided over its absolute annihilation. The visible, physical catastrophe at the Athenian River was immense, but the invisible, psychological catastrophe was vastly greater still, because the entire moral and strategic architecture of Athenian invincibility had been violently torn open, exposed, and entirely shattered before the watching eyes of the entire Greek world. The absolute final losses in Sicily were genuinely staggering. Hundreds of priceless ships vanished. Mountains of silver vanished. Thousands of elite hoplites vanished. The most experienced commanders vanished. But for a maritime, naval empire, one specific category of loss demands immense special emphasis: the rowers. The sheer power of Athens depended not merely on wooden hulls and ambitious generals, but on the massive, highly trained human infrastructure, tens of thousands of skilled human beings capable of seamlessly turning vast fleets into synchronized instruments of absolute power. The meat grinder of Sicily consumed that irreplaceable human infrastructure on a truly terrible generational scale. Therefore, the disaster was not merely a single, unfortunate battlefield reverse. It was a fatal, incredibly deep wound to the very operating system of the empire itself. Any empire depends strictly on belief just as much as it depends on physical force. Subjugated states and uneasy, coerced allies obey not merely because they constantly fear violent punishment, but because they implicitly assume that the imperial center remains supremely capable, vastly organized, and continuously fortunate. The slaughter in Sicily utterly punctured that core assumption. Once the great city of Athens publicly appeared deeply vulnerable, rebellion instantly became a thinkable option. And once rebellion became thinkable, routine imperial management became infinitely harder, infinitely more expensive everywhere at once. This is the exact, terrifying psychology of hegemonic decline. The loss that truly matters most is very rarely the loss of a specific fortress or a specific fleet. It is the absolute loss of the aura of inevitability. Sparta, and soon the massive wealth of the Persian Empire, now confronted a deeply weakened, reeling Athens. The immense material losses of ships and men mattered deeply, but the psychological losses mattered vastly more. The disaster entirely opened the pathways to highly intensified defection, vastly broader allied revolt, and a far harsher, more brutal phase of the overall war. Athens, astonishingly, did not completely collapse immediately in 413 BC. They rebuilt fleets and fought on for another decade. That specific fact is incredibly important, because incredibly great powers very often survive their own catastrophic blunders far longer than anyone expects. But survival after executing a massive act of strategic self-maiming is not the same as vindication. It is merely the painful, bloody prolongation of an inevitable reckoning. The dark road to the final, total defeat of Athens in 404 BC did not strictly begin in Sicily alone, but the disaster in Sicily made that dark road vastly, unstoppably steeper. Ultimately, the Sicilian Expedition vividly exposes one of the absolute central paradoxes of democracy operating at an imperial scale. Democratic systems can undeniably mobilize incredibly extraordinary energy. They can draw upon incredibly broad public participation, deep civic commitment, and boundless, astonishing confidence. They can easily produce breathtaking acts of daring. But massive collective energy always carries its own unique, terrifying dangers. In moments of intense, collective excitement, democracies can easily reward highly expansive, impossible promises, angrily frame rational prudence as cowardly timidity, and conveniently distribute political responsibility so widely that no single hand ever fully owns the ultimate risk. Therefore, grand, world-altering ventures become vastly easier to enthusiastically launch than to actually, rigorously define. The massive assembly that enthusiastically authorizes unparalleled magnificence may only discover, far too late, that magnificence is absolutely not the same thing as a viable strategy. Yet the sheer catastrophe cannot be casually reduced to a simple, comforting fable that democracy is inherently reckless while oligarchy is inherently prudent. That conclusion would be entirely intellectually lazy. Sparta itself routinely made highly grave errors elsewhere, and strict oligarchic systems are certainly no strangers to vanity, institutional rigidity, or disastrously unwinnable wars. The true, enduring lesson is vastly more profound. Political systems of absolutely every kind become exceedingly dangerous when their internal incentives reward pure confidence far more than absolute accuracy, when their geopolitical prestige drastically outruns their actual intelligence, and when their leaders slowly learn that endlessly enlarging strategic objectives is far easier and far more popular than clearly defining them. The destruction of Athens in Sicily is therefore not merely a democratic warning. It is a terrifying civilizational warning. No single, isolated individual can entirely explain the sheer scale of the disaster. Alcibiades perfectly embodied unmatched brilliance entirely devoid of discipline. Nicias perfectly embodied deep caution entirely devoid of decisiveness. Lamachus possessed military clarity entirely without sufficient political influence. Demosthenes brought harsh realism entirely too late. Gylippus perfectly embodied the immense power of adaptive, localized intervention. The Athenian Assembly vividly reflected raw ambition, deep fear, and a terrifying susceptibility to grand rhetoric. Syracuse stunningly revealed the immense strategic resilience of a community suddenly facing its own extinction. The catastrophe was highly, intrinsically systemic. And that is precisely exactly why it remains so incredibly, terrifyingly modern. Deeply complex, systemic failures are always the most profoundly instructive failures because they completely resist the easy comfort of pointing to a single villain. At the deepest, most foundational level, the Sicilian Expedition was a fundamental crisis of limits. Athens possessed immense power, vast wealth, supreme confidence, and very real, incredibly pressing strategic problems. Therefore, the ambition to act was not, in and of itself, totally irrational. The truly fatal error lay elsewhere. The great city entirely lost the critical ability to distinguish the realistically achievable from the deeply intoxicating. Once that vital, intellectual distinction collapses, powerful states inevitably begin to speak of mere possibility as though it were absolute probability, and of probability as though it were divine destiny. This is exactly why the campaign endures as vastly more than a mere ancient Greek tragedy. It is a timeless, chilling study in how incredibly successful systems become terminally vulnerable to their very own habits. Repeated, glorious triumphs slowly teach institutions to deeply trust relentless escalation. Imperial routines slowly normalize incredibly dangerous intervention. Domestic political competition massively rewards audacity over caution. Vital intelligence becomes slowly, irrevocably distorted by the gravity of hope. Temporary, fleeting opportunities are dangerously reclassified as absolute necessities. And then, eventually, a distant, totally unnecessary theater, initially entered merely to enhance an empire's freedom of action, begins slowly, inevitably to absorb supreme attention, irreplaceable resources, political legitimacy, and critical strategic flexibility, until the great power suddenly wakes up to discover that it has become the helpless, bleeding captive of its own grand adventure. The verdict of history is completely severe. The Sicilian Expedition did not merely fail to expand Athenian power. It violently inverted the absolute core purpose for which it had been so arrogantly launched. Athens went west desperately seeking leverage, infinite wealth, and a decisive, permanent advantage in a prolonged, grinding war. It eventually returned, insofar as any shattered fragments returned at all, with vastly depleted fleets, utterly shattered manpower, permanently damaged prestige, and heavily emboldened enemies eagerly rising across the entire Greek world. The true, ultimate cost was not only counted in the terrible arithmetic of dead soldiers or sunken ships. It was strictly counted in the absolute destruction of their strategic confidence and the glaring, permanent exposure of their own imperial vulnerability. The modern mirror that this tragedy holds up to us is absolutely impossible to ignore. Contemporary societies still constantly confuse sheer motion with actual control. Great states still desperately persuade themselves that heavily armed, distant commitments will somehow magically stabilize their own core insecurities. Political classes still continuously discover that bold, simplistic promises travel vastly faster than sober, complex calculations. Powerful institutions still ruthlessly punish rational retreat far more visibly than they punish catastrophic misadventure. The names of the politicians have changed, the technologies of warfare have vastly changed, and the maps of the world have entirely changed. But the raw, underlying human mechanism remains hauntingly, terrifyingly familiar. Grand ambition expands first in the rhetoric of leaders, then it expands in the massive budgets of the state, then it violently expands in physical deployments, and only at the very bitter end does reality finally ruthlessly send its devastating invoice. The deepest, most enduring lesson here is not that ambition itself is always inevitably ruinous. Civilizations achieve absolutely nothing of enduring value through mere cowardice alone. But grand ambition, entirely devoid of a highly disciplined theory of limits, inevitably becomes wildly self-destructive. Great states very rarely perish because they are simply unable to act. Far more often, they deeply imperil themselves because they become entirely unable to rationally discriminate between what can realistically be mastered, what can merely be attempted, and what must be absolutely refused, no matter how incredibly glorious it initially appears. The legacy question, then, as we look back upon the shattered hulls resting at the bottom of the great harbor of Syracuse, is not simply why the Athenians failed so spectacularly in Sicily. The true question is why human communities, when heavily armed with the intoxicating momentum of their own past success, so consistently, so tragically begin to believe that the horizon itself is a command, rather than a boundary.